For years, the Duggar family stood as one of reality television's most recognizable symbols of conservative family values. Through shows like 19 Kids and Counting, viewers were introduced to a world built around strict rules, modesty standards, religious discipline, and the idea that happiness came through complete obedience to faith and family structure. To many fans, the family appeared almost untouchable, organized, unified, and deeply committed to living differently from mainstream culture. But over time, cracks slowly began to appear in that carefully maintained image. Public scandals, family divisions, and personal testimonies from several Duggar children began changing the way audiences viewed the once polished reality TV empire. Among the siblings who have spoken most openly about that experience is Jinger Duggar Vuolo. Over the last few years, she has gradually separated herself from some of the strict teachings she was raised under, particularly those connected to the religious environment that shaped much of her childhood. Now, in one of her most personal reflections yet, Jinger is speaking candidly about the emotional pressure she carried for years while trying to maintain what she described as a perfect facade. Her comments have sparked widespread discussion online because they reveal a side of her life that viewers rarely saw during the height of the family's television fame. What makes these revelations especially emotional for many fans is her openness about insecurity and self-worth. Jinger admitted that she often struggled internally with fear, pressure, and the belief that she constantly had to meet impossible expectations. Despite eventually building a new life outside many of the family's old rules, she revealed that she still finds herself amazed that her husband, Jeremy Vuolo, chose to marry her. For longtime followers of the Duggar family, that statement stood out immediately. On the surface, viewers often saw Jinger as one of the more independent and relatable Duggar daughters. But behind the scenes, she says she was carrying years of emotional conditioning that shaped how she viewed herself, relationships, and even her own identity. Jinger's journey away from the culture she grew up in did not happen overnight. Much of her upbringing was influenced by the teachings of Bill Gothard and the broader environment connected to the Institute in Basic Life Principles, often referred to as IBLP. The organization promoted highly conservative teachings about gender roles, authority, modesty, and family hierarchy. Over time, critics argued that many of those teachings created unhealthy pressure, especially for women raised inside the system. Former followers have spoken publicly about fear-based messaging, rigid expectations, and the constant pressure to appear spiritually perfect no matter what was happening internally. Jinger has increasingly become one of the most recognizable former members willing to discuss those experiences publicly. Rather than fully rejecting faith altogether, she has explained that her personal journey involved separating her relationship with Christianity from teachings she now believes were harmful or overly controlling. That distinction has become central to her public identity. Instead of portraying herself as someone abandoning religion entirely, Jinger often speaks about rebuilding faith in a healthier way, one that allows room for individuality, personal growth, and emotional honesty. A major turning point in that transformation came after meeting Jeremy Vuolo. Their relationship quickly attracted public attention because fans noticed differences almost immediately. Jeremy appeared more open to mainstream culture than the Duggar family traditionally allowed. Over time, viewers saw Jinger begin wearing pants, exploring new hobbies, traveling more freely, and expressing herself in ways that would once have been discouraged in her childhood environment. To outside audiences, those changes may have looked small. But for someone raised under strict expectations governing nearly every aspect of daily life, they represented a dramatic personal shift. Jinger has acknowledged that marriage played a significant role in helping her rethink many of the beliefs she inherited growing up. She has credited Jeremy with encouraging her to ask questions, study scripture independently, and challenge ideas she had previously accepted without hesitation. At the same time, her recent reflections show that personal growth does not instantly erase years of emotional conditioning. Even after building a different life, she still appears to wrestle with lingering insecurities connected to perfectionism and self-worth. That honesty is one reason many people say her story resonates beyond reality television. Viewers who grew up in strict households, religious or otherwise, often recognize the emotional burden that comes from constantly feeling responsible for maintaining appearances. For years, the Duggar family brand depended heavily on the image of moral perfection. Their television success was built around presenting an orderly, faith-centered household that seemed fundamentally different from mainstream American culture. But maintaining that image likely came with enormous pressure, especially for children growing up in front of cameras. Unlike most teenagers, the Duggar children experienced adolescence while millions of viewers watched their behavior, clothing choices, courtships, and personal milestones. Every action became part of a larger public narrative about family values and spiritual success. Jinger now appears increasingly willing to acknowledge how exhausting that environment could become emotionally. Rather than continuing to defend the illusion of perfection, she has chosen vulnerability, admitting that much of her life involved trying to live up to expectations that were impossible to maintain indefinitely. Her comments about Jeremy are especially revealing in that context. Saying she remains amazed he married her suggests that beneath the public image, she struggled privately with feelings of inadequacy and doubt for years. For many fans, that admission humanizes someone who spent much of her life being portrayed as part of an idealized television family. It also reflects a broader shift happening among several former reality TV personalities who are beginning to speak more openly about the emotional cost of growing up under constant public scrutiny. In recent years, audiences have become increasingly interested in what happens behind the scenes of family-centered reality television. Former child stars and reality TV participants have shared stories about pressure, identity struggles, and the difficulty of separating public image from personal reality. Jinger's story fits into that larger conversation. While her experience is deeply connected to religion and family culture, it also reflects universal themes about identity, expectations, and the fear of disappointing others. Another reason her reflections are generating attention is because they contrast so sharply with the image viewers once saw on television. During the height of the Duggar family's popularity, emotional vulnerability was rarely emphasized publicly. The family often focused on positivity, discipline, and maintaining composure. Now, years later, Jinger's willingness to discuss insecurity and emotional struggle marks a dramatic change from the environment many viewers remember. At the center of her journey appears to be a growing commitment to authenticity. Rather than trying to maintain the perfect facade she referenced, she now seems more focused on honesty, even when that honesty reveals painful emotions or uncomfortable truths about her upbringing. That transition is not always easy, especially when someone's identity has been tied for years to public expectations and religious standards. Yet many supporters believe Jinger's openness may help others who experienced similar environments feel less alone. Her evolving relationship with family tradition also continues to attract attention. While she has remained connected to relatives, her personal choices increasingly reflect independence from many of the rules that once defined Duggar life. That balance between maintaining family ties while redefining personal beliefs has become one of the most closely watched aspects of her story. For longtime viewers, the transformation is striking. The young woman once known primarily as one of many children in a tightly controlled household is now speaking openly about emotional healing, self-discovery, and learning to live without the constant pressure of appearing perfect. And perhaps that is why her recent reflections resonate so strongly. Beneath the celebrity headlines and reality TV legacy is a deeply human story about identity, insecurity, and the difficult process of rebuilding confidence after years spent trying to meet impossible expectations. As Jinger Duggar continues sharing more about her experiences, many fans believe her story is no longer just about escaping strict rules. It's about learning how to define herself outside the image that once shaped her entire world. To understand why Jinger Duggar's recent comments resonated so strongly with viewers, it's important to understand the environment she was raised in. For most of her life, Jinger existed inside a world built around strict expectations. The Duggar household operated under highly structured rules involving modest clothing, limited entertainment, strict gender roles, and constant accountability. Nearly every aspect of daily life revolved around faith and obedience. And because millions of viewers watched the family on television, those expectations became even heavier. Unlike many teenagers growing up in front of cameras, Jinger wasn't simply dealing with public attention. She was growing up inside a belief system where questioning authority or expressing doubt could be seen as spiritually dangerous. From the outside, the Duggar family appeared calm, organized, and deeply united. But behind that image, there was immense pressure to maintain perfection at all times. Former viewers of 19 Kids and Counting often remembered Jinger as the sibling who seemed slightly different from the rest. She occasionally hinted at wanting experiences outside Arkansas life. She talked about photography, traveling, and living in a city one day. Small comments like those stood out because they contrasted with the carefully controlled environment surrounding her. At the time, many fans saw those moments as harmless personality traits. Years later, they began to look more significant. In interviews reflecting on her younger years, Jinger has explained that fear shaped much of her thinking. Fear of disappointing her parents, fear of making the wrong decision, fear that even minor mistakes could lead to devastating consequences spiritually or emotionally. That constant pressure affected how she viewed herself. When Jinger later admitted she was surprised Jeremy Vuolo wanted to marry her, many people were shocked by how deeply insecure she sounded. Viewers who had watched her on television for years assumed she had confidence, stability, and certainty. But her own reflections painted a very different picture. Instead, she described someone who struggled privately with self-worth while trying to project composure publicly. And that disconnect between the public version of Jinger and the private reality behind the scenes became one of the most revealing parts of her story. For years, audiences only saw edited episodes, family interviews, and carefully presented moments. What they didn't see were the internal doubts developing quietly beneath the surface. As Jinger grew older, those doubts eventually forced her to start reevaluating beliefs she had accepted her entire life. That process would ultimately change not only her marriage and lifestyle, but also her entire identity. As the Duggar family's popularity exploded across reality television, life inside the household became something few people could truly imagine. What started as television specials eventually grew into the hit series 19 Kids and Counting, turning the family into one of the most recognizable conservative Christian families in America. Millions of viewers tuned in to watch the daily routines of Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar and their 19 children, fascinated by the family's strict values, modest lifestyle, and highly organized household. To many viewers, the Duggars appeared disciplined, wholesome, and unusually united. The family became known for strict schedules, chore systems, modest clothing standards, supervised courtships, and carefully defined gender roles. Their lives seemed almost completely structured around faith, obedience, and maintaining harmony within the household. Over time, that image became more than just part of the show. It became the Duggar family brand. For the children growing up inside that environment, however, the experience was far more complicated than what audiences saw on television. Cameras were present during ordinary moments, emotional conversations, family milestones, and even difficult periods of life. In many ways, the Duggar children grew up performing versions of themselves for public consumption before they were old enough to fully understand what that meant. For Jinger Duggar in particular, the pressure appears to have been especially intense. Even during the family's television years, many viewers noticed she seemed different from some of her siblings. While others often appeared enthusiastic about the family's strict structure and public image, Jinger frequently came across as quieter, more reflective, and sometimes uncertain. Fans often commented that she appeared to have a more independent curiosity, about the world outside the environment she was raised in. That curiosity, however, existed inside a system where individuality was often discouraged. The Duggar household emphasized obedience above almost everything else. Children were taught to respect authority, avoid questioning leadership, and follow clearly defined expectations. Public behavior mattered enormously because the family believed they represented not only themselves, but also their faith and values to millions of viewers. As a result, maintaining appearances became deeply important. Smiles, politeness, modesty, and emotional control were all part of the image audiences saw on television. Mistakes, doubts, frustrations, or personal struggles were rarely discussed publicly. The family projected consistency and perfection so successfully that many viewers believed the Duggars had discovered the secret to raising a happy, problem-free household. But for children growing up under constant visibility, that kind of pressure can become emotionally exhausting. In highly controlled public environments, young people often learn very early that acceptance is connected to behavior. They begin monitoring their words, reactions, and emotions because they fear disappointing authority figures or damaging the family image. Over time, suppressing individuality can become second nature. Instead of learning how to express uncertainty or disagreement openly, many children raised in these environments learn how to hide discomfort behind composure. For Jinger, those pressures may have created an internal conflict between who she truly was and who she believed she needed to be. Later in life, she would speak more openly about struggling with fear, anxiety, and pressure connected to her upbringing. While audiences saw confidence and stability on screen, Jinger has suggested that internally she often felt overwhelmed by expectations and deeply afraid of making mistakes. The emphasis on obedience and perfection did not necessarily create emotional security. It sometimes created fear of failure. That emotional burden can be particularly difficult in families whose identities become public brands. Once millions of people begin associating a family with perfection, every member can feel responsible for protecting that image. In situations like that, children may feel there is little room to explore their own identity, opinions, or emotions honestly. Any deviation from expectations can begin to feel dangerous. Viewers who revisit old episodes of Counting On and earlier Duggar appearances sometimes notice subtle signs of this tension in Jinger. While she often smiled and participated fully in family activities, there were moments where she appeared more reserved or introspective than her siblings. Some fans interpreted that as shyness, while others now believe it may have reflected deeper internal struggles that were hidden beneath the polished public image. As the Duggar family's fame continued growing, so did the pressure to maintain that carefully constructed appearance. And although audiences continued seeing a smiling, united family on television, Jinger would later reveal that much of her internal world had been shaped not by confidence or peace, but by anxiety, fear, and the exhausting pressure to appear perfect at all times. As Jinger Duggar grew older and gained distance from the environment she was raised in, she slowly began speaking more openly about the emotional struggles she had carried for years behind the scenes. While viewers often saw her smiling on camera during the family's television years, Jinger later admitted that internally, she dealt with deep insecurity, fear, anxiety, and constant pressure to live up to expectations that felt impossible to fully satisfy. What surprised many fans was not simply that she struggled, but how long she says those feelings stayed with her, even into adulthood. In interviews and personal reflections, Jinger explained that much of her fear came from growing up in a highly controlled environment where obedience and perfection were emphasized constantly. The family's public image revolved around discipline, modesty, strict gender roles, and presenting a polished version of faith-based family life to millions of viewers. Over time, that pressure appeared to shape how she viewed herself. Jinger described feeling emotionally restricted for much of her younger life. Rather than learning how to process emotions openly, she often felt pressure to suppress doubts, fears, or personal struggles in order to maintain the appearance of spiritual strength and happiness. That kind of environment can leave people constantly questioning whether they are good enough, even when they are doing everything they were taught to do. And according to Jinger, that mindset followed her for years. She later spoke about carrying shame and anxiety well into adulthood, feelings tied to the fear of disappointing others, disappointing God, or failing to meet the standards she had been taught were necessary for approval and acceptance. Many viewers said those admissions helped explain why Jinger often appeared quieter and more hesitant than some of her siblings during the family's reality television years. One of the most revealing aspects of her reflections involved how strict teachings affected her self-esteem. Jinger explained that she spent much of her life trying to measure up spiritually and personally, always wondering whether she was falling short. The emphasis on rules, purity, obedience, and perfection left little room for mistakes or individuality. Over time, she began questioning some of the fear-based religious messaging she had grown up with. According to Jinger, many teachings she once accepted unquestioningly eventually started creating emotional exhaustion rather than peace. She later explained that she began realizing how much of her faith experience had been driven by fear. Fear of doing the wrong thing, fear of disappointing authority figures, fear of judgment, and fear of losing approval. That realization became one of the biggest turning points in her life. But perhaps the moment that generated the strongest public reaction came when Jinger made a surprisingly vulnerable comment about her husband, Jeremy Vuolo. Reflecting on their relationship, she admitted that she was still amazed he chose to marry her. For many viewers, the statement was striking. Some fans interpreted the comment as sadness or insecurity, while others saw it as a heartbreaking glimpse into how deeply her upbringing had affected the way she viewed herself. Rather than hearing a woman lacking confidence today, many viewers believed they were hearing someone who had spent years internalizing the message that she was never quite enough. That distinction became important in public conversations surrounding her interviews. A large number of viewers related strongly to what Jinger described because her experience reflects something psychologists and former members of high-control environments often discuss openly. Even after leaving restrictive systems behind, the emotional impact can remain for years. People raised in environments centered around control, fear, or rigid expectations frequently struggle with identity, confidence, self-worth, and decision-making long after physically leaving those environments. Many spend years trying to separate who they truly are from who they were told they had to be. For viewers who connected with Jinger's story, her vulnerability felt less like weakness and more like honesty. They saw someone trying to unpack years of emotional conditioning while learning how to build confidence outside the framework she grew up in. Others praised her willingness to discuss anxiety and insecurity publicly, especially given how strongly the Duggar family brand had once emphasized perfection and certainty. And for longtime followers of the family, that honesty represented a dramatic contrast from the carefully controlled image viewers had seen for years on television. Instead of presenting herself as someone who had all the answers, Jinger appeared increasingly willing to acknowledge confusion, fear, emotional struggle, and personal growth. That openness helped many viewers see her not simply as a former reality television personality, but as someone navigating the difficult process of redefining herself after growing up under intense public and religious pressure. And according to Jinger, meeting Jeremy Vuolo became one of the major turning points that slowly changed how she viewed both herself and the world around her. When Jinger Duggar first met Jeremy Vuolo, many longtime viewers of the Duggar family immediately sensed something different about the relationship. Unlike the courtships fans had watched within the Duggar world before, Jeremy came from a background that felt noticeably outside the family's tightly controlled environment. He had attended college, played professional soccer, traveled extensively, and appeared far more outspoken and worldly than the men viewers typically saw connected to the Duggar circle. Their personalities also contrasted in ways audiences found fascinating. Jinger often appeared quiet, cautious, and reserved during her years on television, especially while living under the strict expectations of her family's household. Jeremy, on the other hand, projected confidence and independence. In interviews, he seemed comfortable challenging ideas, engaging in deeper conversations, and encouraging broader experiences. Fans quickly noticed that around Jeremy, Jinger appeared more relaxed and increasingly willing to express her own opinions. At the time, many viewers interpreted their relationship as a turning point for her. But what made the situation more interesting was that the transformation did not happen overnight. It wasn't as simple as Jeremy rescuing Jinger from her upbringing. Instead, their relationship seemed to create an environment where she finally had space to question things she had long accepted without challenge. For someone raised in a system where obedience and conformity were heavily emphasized, simply being exposed to a different perspective could have a profound emotional impact. One of the biggest changes came after Jinger moved away from Arkansas. Leaving the Duggar family home represented more than just relocating geographically. It marked the beginning of a completely different phase of life. Suddenly, she was living in larger cities, meeting new people, and experiencing environments far removed from the sheltered world in which she had grown up. Over time, viewers watched her become noticeably more confident in public appearances and interviews. Fans especially focused on her evolving fashion choices. For years, the Duggar daughters had followed strict modesty rules that discouraged certain clothing styles. But after marrying Jeremy, Jinger slowly began dressing differently, wearing pants, experimenting with modern styles, and presenting herself in ways that would have once been considered unacceptable within her childhood environment. To many observers, those outward changes symbolized something deeper, a growing willingness to make personal decisions for herself rather than simply following expectations. Her lifestyle changes extended beyond clothing. Jinger gradually became more outspoken about anxiety, fear, and personal struggles. Earlier in her television years, she rarely appeared comfortable discussing vulnerable emotions publicly. But as time passed, audiences noticed her becoming more reflective and self-aware. She seemed increasingly willing to discuss topics like insecurity, religious pressure, and the emotional toll of constantly trying to maintain a perfect image. Still, public reactions to Jeremy's influence were deeply divided. Some fans viewed him positively, believing he encouraged Jinger to think independently and experience life outside the strict Duggar framework. Others were more skeptical. Critics argued that while her environment had changed, she was still operating within another highly structured religious world, just a different version of it. Online debates frequently questioned whether Jinger had truly found freedom or had simply exchanged one authority structure for another. At the same time, some longtime Duggar supporters were uncomfortable with the changes they saw in her. To more conservative fans, Jinger's evolving beliefs, appearance, and public statements seemed like a rejection of the values that originally made the family famous. Meanwhile, some critics felt her transformation did not go far enough. That tension placed Jinger in an unusually difficult position. Criticized both by people who thought she had changed too much and by others who believed she had not changed enough. What made her journey so compelling to many viewers was the complexity of it all. Redefining identity after spending years inside a rigid belief system is rarely simple or immediate. For Jinger, personal growth appeared to happen gradually, through exposure to new experiences, new conversations, and increasing distance from the expectations that once defined nearly every aspect of her life. Rather than presenting herself as having all the answers, she often spoke as someone still processing years of fear, pressure, and emotional conditioning. And as she continued opening up publicly, it became increasingly clear that the most significant shift was not just about clothing, lifestyle, or moving away from home. The deeper transformation began when Jinger started openly questioning the teachings that had shaped her entire childhood, and the fear-based messages she says affected her for years. By this point in her public journey, Jinger Duggar was no longer speaking in vague or carefully polished language. Instead, she began openly discussing the emotional pressure of trying to maintain what she later described as a perfect facade. For years, viewers had watched the Duggar family present an image built around certainty, discipline, happiness, and unwavering faith. But behind that image, Jinger says she was quietly struggling with fear, anxiety, and the constant pressure to appear spiritually right at all times. One of the biggest shifts fans noticed was her growing willingness to talk about authenticity. Rather than pretending everything from her childhood was healthy or beneficial, Jinger began acknowledging that some teachings she followed had deeply affected her emotionally. She explained that she spent years afraid of making mistakes, afraid of disappointing others, and afraid that stepping outside strict expectations could have serious spiritual consequences. For many viewers, those admissions were shocking, not because they seemed unbelievable, but because they sounded painfully honest. Jinger also started speaking about the pressure public figures face when their identity becomes tied to an image. Growing up on reality television meant millions of people watched her life while assuming they understood it completely. Social media only intensified that pressure. Public personalities are often expected to look happy, confident, grateful, and put together at all times, even when privately struggling. Jinger's decision to admit that things were not always perfect challenged years of carefully managed appearances, and forced many fans to reconsider what they thought they knew about the Duggar family dynamic. That honesty became even more visible with the release of her book and the interviews that followed. Rather than attacking her family directly, Jinger focused much of her attention on discussing specific teachings and belief systems that she says shaped her fears and insecurities. She described realizing that some ideas she once accepted unquestioningly had created unhealthy emotional patterns in her life. Those conversations sparked major reactions online. Some longtime supporters praised her courage and vulnerability, while others accused her of criticizing the environment that made her famous in the first place. The public response revealed just how divided audiences can become when someone begins questioning a belief system they were raised inside. To some viewers, Jinger's story represented growth, healing, and personal independence. To others, it felt like betrayal or rejection of values they still strongly supported. That tension also fueled endless speculation about how her honesty may have affected relationships within the Duggar family itself. While Jinger has generally tried to speak carefully and respectfully, fans have continued to analyze every interview, social media post, and public appearance for signs of family strain or disagreement. What made Jinger's story resonate so strongly, though, was not simply the reality television fame or the religious background. It was the emotional experience underneath it. Many people, even those who never grew up in highly conservative environments, understand what it feels like to hide struggles behind a carefully maintained image. The pressure to appear happy, successful, faithful, or emotionally stable can exist in countless different environments. Religious communities, families, workplaces, schools, and even online spaces. That is why so many former fans and new supporters connected with her story on a personal level. Her experience also opened broader conversations about religious deconstruction and the emotional difficulty of challenging lifelong beliefs. For people raised in highly controlled systems, questioning those beliefs can feel terrifying because identity, family, morality, and community are often deeply connected together. Walking away from certain teachings does not simply mean changing opinions. It can feel like risking relationships, stability, and one's entire understanding of the world. Jinger's willingness to discuss that process publicly gave visibility to a struggle many people go through privately. The conversation surrounding her story also touches on the larger issue of public identity versus private reality. Families or communities that become symbols of perfection often create enormous pressure for individuals within them to suppress doubt, pain, or disagreement. In fear-based environments, appearances can become more important than emotional honesty. Over time, that can lead people to disconnect from their own feelings simply to maintain acceptance and approval. Psychologists and former members of highly controlled groups often describe how environments centered around fear and rigid obedience can shape a person's self-worth for years. Constant pressure to measure up can create anxiety, guilt, perfectionism, and difficulty trusting one's own judgment. Jinger's reflections brought attention to how deeply those patterns can affect people emotionally, even long after they leave the environment itself. And perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate with so many viewers. Not because everyone lived the exact same life she did, but because many people understand the exhausting pressure of pretending everything is okay while struggling internally. Her journey reflects a broader human experience, the difficult process of separating genuine identity from the roles and expectations imposed by others. And today, Jinger appears focused less on maintaining an image and more on building a life that feels genuine to her. Today, Jinger Duggar occupies a very different place in the public eye than she did during the height of the Duggar family's reality television fame. Years ago, viewers mostly saw her as one of the quieter daughters in a tightly controlled environment, someone who rarely challenged the expectations placed around her. But over time, especially through interviews, public appearances, podcasts, and her writing, audiences have watched her gradually develop a more independent and reflective public voice. What makes that transformation so noticeable is not that Jinger suddenly became loud or rebellious. In many ways, she still comes across as thoughtful, careful, and reserved. The difference is that she now seems far more comfortable expressing uncertainty, discussing emotional struggles, and acknowledging that parts of her upbringing deeply affected her worldview. That openness alone marks a major shift from the image viewers once associated with the Duggar brand, an image built around certainty, perfection, and unwavering confidence. Motherhood has also become a major part of how audiences now see her. In interviews and social media posts, Jinger often appears focused on creating stability and balance within her own household while raising her daughters alongside Jeremy Vuolo. Viewers who followed her from childhood into adulthood have noticed how much her priorities appear centered around giving her children a different emotional experience than the one she sometimes describes from her own upbringing. While she still values faith and family, many fans believe she approaches those ideas with more flexibility and self-awareness than what people saw during her reality television years. At the same time, Jinger's relationship with fame appears far more complicated now than it once did. Growing up on television meant living under constant public observation during some of the most formative years of her life. For years, millions of people consumed the Duggar family's carefully curated image without fully understanding what life behind the scenes may have felt like emotionally. Now, as an adult, Jinger seems much more selective and intentional about public exposure. She still participates in interviews and media projects, but there's a sense that she's trying to control her own narrative rather than simply fulfill a role inside a family brand. That shift is one reason many audiences now view her differently from some of her relatives. In the past, the Duggar family largely projected a unified public message. Disagreements, struggles, and emotional tension were rarely discussed openly. But Jinger's willingness to acknowledge fear, anxiety, pressure, and harmful teachings introduced a level of vulnerability that longtime viewers had almost never seen associated with the family before. For some supporters, that honesty has made her more relatable than ever. Many people who grew up in strict religious environments, or even in households where image mattered more than emotional honesty, connected deeply with her story. They saw someone attempting to untangle years of pressure while still preserving parts of her identity and faith that remained meaningful to her. Instead of completely rejecting her past, Jinger appeared to be trying to understand it honestly. But not everyone has responded positively. Critics from multiple sides continue debating her choices. Some conservative supporters believe she has spoken too openly about private family matters or has drifted too far from the values that originally made the Duggars famous. Meanwhile, others argue she still hasn't gone far enough in addressing the deeper issues surrounding the culture she was raised in. That divide has placed Jinger in an unusual position, criticized by some for changing too much, while criticized by others for changing too little. And yet, that tension may actually explain why her story continues resonating with so many people. Real personal growth rarely happens in a perfectly clean or universally approved way. Jinger's evolution has unfolded publicly, slowly, and sometimes awkwardly, with millions of viewers analyzing each step along the way. One of the biggest unanswered questions is whether she will continue speaking more openly about her upbringing in the future. Each interview and book release seems to reveal slightly more about how deeply fear, performance, and pressure shaped her earlier years. Some believe she may eventually become even more candid about the emotional realities behind the Duggar family's public image. Others think she may choose to protect certain relationships and maintain boundaries around what she discusses publicly. Either way, the long-term impact of growing up inside the Duggar spotlight is impossible to ignore. The family once represented a very specific vision of faith, discipline, and traditional family life to millions of viewers across America. But over the years, public perception of the Duggars has changed dramatically due to scandals, criticism, documentaries, and first-hand accounts from family members themselves. The image that once appeared almost untouchable now feels far more complicated and contested. And within that broader shift, Jinger stands out because she became one of the first family members willing to openly examine the emotional consequences of growing up inside that world. Rather than simply defending the past or pretending everything was perfect, she acknowledged that some of the teachings and expectations she internalized created fear, shame, and insecurity that followed her into adulthood. That honesty fundamentally separates her current public image from the polished version audiences once saw on television. As this chapter of her story continues unfolding, what stands out most is that Jinger's journey does not appear driven by rebellion for the sake of rebellion. Instead, it feels rooted in something much more personal and relatable: the difficult process of learning how to exist without constantly performing perfection for other people. For someone raised inside one of reality television's most controlled family images, that may be the most significant transformation of all. As conversations around the Duggar family continue to evolve, Jinger Duggar's story has become about much more than reality television. For many viewers, her journey reflects something deeply relatable: the challenge of separating your own identity from the expectations placed on you by family, culture, religion, or the image you feel pressured to maintain. Her emotional admission that she still amazed Jeremy Vuolo, married her, gave audiences a rare glimpse into the insecurities she carried for years beneath the polished public image fans once saw on television. It highlighted how deeply self-doubt and fear can shape a person's sense of worth, especially when they grow up in an environment centered around perfection, obedience, and constant public scrutiny. Whether people agree with every decision she's made or not, many viewers see her willingness to speak openly about her struggles as a major turning point from the carefully controlled image that once defined the Duggar brand. Instead of presenting a flawless facade, Jinger has increasingly chosen honesty, even when that honesty sparks criticism, debate, or tension within her own family's fan base. Over time, audiences have watched her slowly redefine her beliefs, her confidence, and the life she wants for herself and her family. And regardless of where her journey leads next, one thing is undeniable: the version of Jinger Duggar the public sees today is very different from the quiet young woman viewers first met years ago on reality television. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.